The moment his hands brushed against mine, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. It was wrong, I knew it was wrong. But as Dr. Carter's voice softened, asking if I was okay, something inside me shattered. My husband's neglect, the empty silence at home, it all pushed me toward a line I swore I'd never cross. And yet, as his gaze lingered, I realized I was already too close to falling. My name is Lisa, and I've been married to Greg for 12 years. On the surface, we had what everyone thought was a perfect life, a stable marriage, a beautiful home, and careers that gave us security. But behind closed doors, everything felt different. Greg was a good man, dependable, hardworking, and loyal. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. Conversations became about schedules and bills. Date nights turned into nights spent in separate rooms. Him on his laptop, me with a book, pretending I didn't notice the growing distance between us. I tried to talk to him about it once, about how lonely I felt, but he brushed it off. "You're overthinking it," he'd said with a dismissive smile. But I wasn't. I felt invisible, like I was disappearing piece by piece, and no one noticed. That's when I met Dr. Carter. It started innocently enough. I'd been experiencing back pain for weeks, and Greg had insisted I see someone about it. Dr. Carter came highly recommended. A specialist with a calming presence and a reputation for putting his patients at ease. The first appointment was routine. He was professional, polite, and focused on my treatment. But there was something about him, his kindness, the way he listened, that made me feel seen for the first time in years. Over the next few weeks, I found myself looking forward to my appointments. Not just for the treatment, but for the way he'd ask how I was doing and genuinely listen to my answers. One day, after a particularly painful session, he lingered a little longer. "Are you sure everything's okay, Lisa?" he asked, his voice low and warm. It caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in so long, and before I knew it, I was spilling everything. The loneliness, the distance in my marriage, the way I felt like a ghost in my own life. He listened, and when I finally stopped talking, he placed a hand on mine. "You deserve to feel valued," he said softly. The way he looked at me in that moment, steady, understanding, was something I hadn't felt in years. And that's when everything began to change. The days after that conversation with Dr. Carter felt like a blur. I kept replaying his words in my mind. "You deserve to feel valued." They weren't just words. They were a lifeline, something I didn't realize I'd been desperate for until he said them. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just grateful for someone who listened. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. My next appointment came faster than expected. This time, I felt nervous walking into his office, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with my back pain. He greeted me with his usual warm smile, but there was something in his eyes, something unspoken. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. I hesitated. "Better. Thanks to you." His smile widened just slightly, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in years. The session started normally enough, but every touch of his hands on my back felt different. More deliberate, more careful. My breath hitched as his fingers lingered a second too long. When he pulled back, I turned to look at him, and our eyes met. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, like something was waiting to happen. "Lisa," he said softly, "you're holding so much tension." I laughed nervously, breaking the moment. "It's just life, I guess." He tilted his head, studying me. "You don't have to carry it all alone." The way he said it, the softness in his voice, it broke something in me. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tightening. The next appointment felt even heavier. This time, he didn't just ask how I was doing, he asked about Greg. "Do you feel like he sees you?" he asked, his voice careful but probing. I froze, my chest tightening. "I don't know," I admitted. "Sometimes, I feel like he's forgotten me." Dr. Carter leaned closer, his gaze steady. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded you how important you are." The words hung in the air, and my pulse raced. I should have told him to stop, to keep things professional. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself opening up to him more and more, sharing thoughts and feelings I hadn't dared to voice before. And with every conversation, every glance, every lingering touch, the line between right and wrong blurred a little more. It wasn't just my appointments that changed. At home, I started noticing the cracks in my marriage more clearly. Greg's distracted responses, his late nights at work, the way he barely looked at me when I spoke. I started questioning everything. Was I really imagining the distance between us, or had I been ignoring it for too long? One evening, while Greg was scrolling through his phone on the couch, I tried to bring it up again. "Do you ever think about us?" I asked, my voice hesitant. He didn't even look up. What do you mean? About where we are. About how things have changed. He sighed, finally glancing at me. Lisa, you're overthinking again. Everything's fine. But it wasn't. And the more he dismissed me, the more I found myself looking forward to my next session with Dr. Carter. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew I was standing on the edge of something I might not be able to come back from. By the time my next appointment came, I couldn't deny the anticipation building inside me. It wasn't just about the treatment anymore. It was about him, Dr. Carter. When I walked into his office that day, his smile felt warmer, his greeting more personal. How are you feeling today, Lisa? He asked, his eyes searching mine. Nervous, I admitted before I could stop myself. He raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on his lips. Why nervous? I don't know, I said quickly, brushing off the question. But the truth was I did know. The session began like all the others, but the air between us felt heavier, like we were both aware of something unspoken lingering just out of reach. His touch, always professional before, now felt different, softer, more deliberate. When his hands moved over my back, I couldn't stop the way my breath hitched. You're tense, he murmured, his voice low. I can't help it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned closer, his hands stilling for a moment. Lisa, you don't have to carry this alone. You're allowed to let someone else take care of you. My heart pounded as his words settled over me, warm and reassuring. When the session ended, I stood to leave, but he stepped in front of me, his gaze locking onto mine. Are you sure you're okay? He asked softly. The concern in his voice, the way he looked at me, it was too much. My defenses crumbled, and before I knew what I was doing, I spoke the words I'd been holding back. No, I said, my voice breaking. I'm not okay. His expression softened, and he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You deserve to feel wanted, Lisa, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my heart racing as his hand lingered on my cheek. I should have stepped back, said something to stop what was happening. But instead, I leaned into his touch. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. Every part of me screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't stop. For the first time in years, I felt alive. When we finally broke apart, I stared at him, breathless and trembling. Lisa, he began, his voice full of something I couldn't name. Regret? Desire? Fear? But I couldn't let him finish. I should go, I said quickly, stepping back. Wait, he said, reaching for my hand. You don't have to go. But I did. I grabbed my things and fled the office, my heart pounding and my mind racing. That night, I couldn't look at Greg. Every time he spoke, every time he touched me, I felt the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me like a storm I couldn't escape. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment that would never happen again. But when Dr. Carter texted me later that night, his words ignited something in me I thought I'd buried. Dr. Carter, I'm sorry if I crossed a line today, but I can't stop thinking about you. My hands trembled as I read the message, torn between guilt and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. And before I could stop myself, I replied, Me, I can't stop thinking about you either. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The days that followed felt like I was living in two separate worlds. At home, I went through the motions, pretending everything was fine while Greg remained oblivious. But in my mind, I was somewhere else, caught in the orbit of Dr. Carter. The text messages between us became a lifeline. They started innocently enough, checking in on my back pain, asking how my day was going. But soon, they became something else entirely. Dr. Carter, I can't wait to see you again. Me, I feel the same. Every message felt like a secret shared, a step further into something I knew I couldn't control. My next appointment was different. The moment I walked into his office, the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. Lisa, he said softly, closing the door behind me. His gaze lingered on me, and my heart pounded as he stepped closer. We need to talk, I said quickly, my voice trembling. About what happened? He asked, his voice calm but cautious. I nodded. It was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened. He studied me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. Do you really believe that? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't know what I believed anymore. Instead of answering, I turned away, but he gently took my hand, stopping me. You don't have to say anything, he said, his voice low. Just tell me this. How do you feel right now? I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Confused. He stepped closer, his hand still holding mine. And if you could stop feeling guilty for one moment, what would you want? The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. And then I gave in. I don't remember who leaned in first, but suddenly his lips were on mine, and everything else fell away. The kiss was urgent, desperate, as if we were both trying to hold on to something fleeting. We ended up in the small back room of his office, our touches growing more frenzied as we lost ourselves completely. I didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about anything except the way he made me feel, wanted, alive, free. But freedom comes with a price. It wasn't until I was getting dressed, the guilt crashing over me like a tidal wave, that I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside the office door. "Is someone out there?" I whispered, panic rising in my chest. Dr. Carter's face darkened as he stepped toward the door, carefully opening it a crack. The color drained from his face. "Lisa, it's Greg." My heart stopped. "What?" I hissed, my voice barely audible. "He must have seen your car," Dr. Carter said, his voice tight with panic. For a moment, I couldn't move. The walls felt like they were closing in around me, and the sound of Greg's voice calling my name from the waiting room sent a chill down my spine. "What do we do?" I whispered. Dr. Carter looked at me, his jaw tight. "Go out the back. Now." I grabbed my bag and slipped out the back door, my hands trembling as I hurried to my car. My mind raced as I drove away, barely able to focus on the road. When I got home, Greg was waiting for me, his expression unreadable. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice sharp. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "I had an appointment." "You knew that?" He narrowed his eyes. "And what took so long?" "I was at the clinic. They said you left an hour ago." My blood turned to ice. I went for a drive after, just to clear my head." Greg's gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, I thought he was going to press further. But instead, he turned away, shaking his head. "I don't know what's going on with you lately, Lisa," he said, his voice quieter now. "But something's not right." He didn't look at me again as he walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the silence. I collapsed onto the couch, my chest heaving as the weight of what I'd done settled over me. Greg didn't know the full truth, not yet. But I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And when it did, I wasn't sure if I'd survive the fallout. The silence at home was suffocating. Greg's questions lingered in the air, unspoken but ever present. He didn't push me further that night, but his cold demeanor said everything. He knew something was wrong, he just didn't know what. But I did. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at Dr. Carter's office. The thrill, the passion, it was all overshadowed by the crushing weight of guilt that followed. I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on salvaging my marriage, but the damage was already done. Dr. Carter kept texting me. "Dr. Carter, are you okay? Dr. Carter, we need to talk." I ignored his messages at first, terrified that Greg would see them. But the pull was still there, stronger than ever. When I finally replied, I told him we needed to stop. We can't do this anymore. It's over." His response came quickly. "Dr. Carter, is that what you really want?" I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Did I want it to end? Yes. No. I didn't know anymore. But the decision was taken out of my hands a few days later. Greg came home early from work, his face pale and his hands shaking. He tossed his phone onto the table, and I saw the screen, an email from an anonymous sender. Attached were pictures of me and Dr. Carter at his office. The color drained from my face. "Care to explain this?" Greg's voice was low, but it was laced with anger and pain. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. "How long?" he demanded, his voice rising. "How long has this been going on?" "Greg, Don't," he snapped, cutting me off. "Don't lie to me, Lisa. I need the truth." I broke down then, the weight of my actions crashing over me. "It wasn't supposed to happen," I said through sobs. "I never meant to hurt you." Greg stared at me, his jaw clenched. "You didn't just hurt me, Lisa. You destroyed us." He grabbed his keys and left, slamming the door behind him. The days that followed were unbearable. Greg moved into the guest room and barely spoke to me. When he did, it was cold, distant, and final. "I can't do this anymore," he said one evening. "I'll talk to a lawyer tomorrow." I begged him to reconsider, but his mind was made up. Dr. Carter tried reaching out again, but I didn't respond. Whatever we had, whatever it was, it had cost me too much. The divorce was quick, and the house felt emptier than ever once Greg was gone. I'd lost him, the life we'd built, and the version of myself I thought I was. And for what? In the end, I had nothing to show for it but regret. After Greg left, the silence became my only companion. The house, once filled with familiar routines and quiet conversations, now echoed with emptiness. It was as if everything I'd built over the years had been erased in an instant. At first, I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into work, spent hours cleaning the house, and even started attending yoga classes in an attempt to regain some sense of balance. But nothing could drown out the voice in my head reminding me of what I'd lost, and why. Greg wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to have his trust shattered or his marriage destroyed. And as much as I wanted to blame Dr. Carter, the truth was, it wasn't his fault either. It was mine. I had allowed myself to believe that I was invisible, that my loneliness was a justification for my actions. I let myself be swept up in the thrill of being wanted, forgetting the consequences of what it would cost. But now, there was nothing left to distract me from the truth. I started therapy. It wasn't easy, but it forced me to confront the parts of myself I'd been too afraid to face. The insecurities I had ignored, the resentment I'd buried, and the fear of growing older and being forgotten. Through it all, I realized something I hadn't seen before. I hadn't just betrayed Greg. I'd betrayed myself. Dr. Carter tried reaching out one last time. "I care about you, Lisa. Please don't shut me out." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Whatever we had wasn't real. It was a distraction, a temporary escape from the version of myself I didn't want to confront. Letting him go was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was necessary. Months passed, and slowly I began to rebuild. I moved out of the house Greg and I had shared, finding a smaller place that felt like mine. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, and started focusing on what made me happy, not just what I thought others expected of me. And for the first time, I began to forgive myself. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm not sure I'll ever fully forgive myself for the pain I caused. But I've learned that healing doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from learning to live with it and doing better moving forward. Greg and I haven't spoken since the divorce, and I don't expect we ever will. But I hope in time he finds peace. As for me, I'm still figuring things out. But I've learned one thing for sure. Love isn't about filling the empty spaces inside you. It's about being whole enough to share yourself with someone else. And now I'm learning how to be whole again. What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a cycle of regret and betrayal? Could you forgive yourself, or would the guilt weigh you down forever? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective on Lisa's journey. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more powerful and emotional stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next.